Hello, I'm James Baker, pastor of Carroll Memorial Baptist Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Welcome. I know some of you, as children, learned the Apostles' Creed, a short but pretty complete list of the doctrines of traditional Christian faith. Do you remember one line in the Apostles' Creed that goes like this? Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. That's where we are today in our study of Matthew chapter 27, the burial of Jesus Christ. Now, earlier in this passage, we saw Jesus crucified. We heard him cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's quoting Psalm 22, and yet at the same time he is fulfilling the prophecy of that psalm. At the 9th hour of the day, in other words, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour of the daily evening sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem in those days, he dismisses his spirit and he commends it to his Father. His redeeming work is now finished. The darkness lifts, the earth quakes, dead saints are resurrected. The veil in the temple of Jerusalem is torn apart from top to bottom. And a Roman centurion in fear and astonishment cries out, "Truly, this was the Son of God." But there's no daylight saving time back then. The hours of daylight are quickly drawing to a close. Now the day of the week is Friday, and the Jews in those days called Friday the day of preparation. That was because the law of Moses forbids doing any work on the Sabbath or Saturday. So if you have chores or laundry or cooking that would typically need to be done on the Sabbath, you would need to prepare for the Sabbath by getting all those chores done the day prior, on the Friday before. And that's how it came to be known as the day of preparation. The dead body of Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah of God, is still hanging on that cross. What's going to happen to the body? At sunset tonight, Friday ends and the Sabbath begins. We've got to get the body off the cross before sundown. Why before sundown? Because that's what Moses said to do back in Deuteronomy chapter 21. Let me read a verse from that chapter to you. "If a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day." So here we are. The body of Jesus needs to be taken down from the cross and be buried before sundown today if we're going to comply with Mosaic law. But before we go any further, we've got to look at two prophecies that have a bearing on the burial of Jesus. One from the New Testament, spoken by Jesus himself. The other from the Old Testament, from the book of Isaiah. Matthew 16 tells us that from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised up on the third day. Now notice how he says that. He doesn't say 3 24-hour periods later. 72 hours later, that would be. No, he doesn't say it that way. He says, on the third day. Well, we know how the story develops. Jesus is going to rise from the dead on Resurrection Sunday morning. So Sunday is day 3. The day before that, Saturday or the Sabbath, is day 2. And today, the day of his crucifixion and burial, is day 1. He must be buried before sundown today. Now there's a second prophecy that ties in with the burial of Jesus also. And that prophecy comes from Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9. "His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death." In other words, he would normally have been buried with the wicked, but he ended up being buried with the rich. Some New Testament historians tell us that the bodies of dead persons who had just been crucified were taken down from their crosses and thrown into a common heap. into a hole in the ground and eventually covered up with no ceremony. Others say that sometimes those bodies were taken to that rubbish heap outside Jerusalem called Gehenna, where the flames never went out. You recall that's a place near Jerusalem that Jesus used for an illustration. We don't want the body of Jesus to be treated that way. We want him to be taken down from the cross and buried before sundown today. So our immediate concern now is, where can we bury the body of Jesus? And with that in mind, let's turn now to our scripture in Matthew chapter 27, beginning with verse 57. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb, and went away. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave. Now on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate, and said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, After 3 days I am to rise again. Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away, and say to the people, He has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard they set a seal on the stone. Now time is passing. It's getting closer to sunset and the end of day 1. The body of Jesus seems like it's headed for a common criminal's grave. But now appears the rich man, prophesied by Isaiah in chapter 53. He was headed for a grave with wicked people, but he ended up with the rich instead. Okay, now what do we know about the man himself, Joseph of Arimathea? All 4 Gospels mention him, but none of them really dwell on him. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, tells us that Joseph was a prominent or honorable man, a member of the council, meaning in this case the Jewish Sanhedrin. In chapter 23 of Luke, we're told that Joseph is a good and righteous man, that he does not consent to what the Sanhedrin has been planning regarding Jesus, or to what the Sanhedrin has actually done regarding Jesus. And Matthew, of course, tells us that Joseph is rich. You see, Matthew often emphasizes the links between the life and ministry of Jesus and Old Testament prophecy. And the richness, the wealth of Joseph of Arimathea is a clear tie-in with the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 53 about the burial of Jesus. He seemed as if he was headed for a grave with wicked people, but he ended up with the rich instead. And finally, the Gospel of John in chapter 19 calls Joseph of Arimathea a disciple, one who is learning from the teachings of Jesus, a follower, in other words. So, he's got money. He's a good man. He's a prominent man in local society. And he's also a follower of Jesus. But Joseph of Arimathea has issues, or one issue at least. He's got an issue because John says he's been a secret disciple of Jesus, following Jesus secretly, out of fear of the religious leaders of that day. After all, he may have a lot to lose as a prominent, well-thought-of man in local society if it gets known that he's listening to and following this itinerant preacher from up there in Galilee. But today, Joseph's life changes forever. He steps up to the plate. We're told he boldly goes in to see Governor Pilate, and he asks for the body of Jesus. Well, the governor is surprised. He's surprised because it often takes longer than just 6 hours for a person to die by crucifixion. That's one of the things that made it so terrible. But Pilate summons the centurion, who confirms that Jesus is dead, and Pilate grants the request. Not made by Jesus' mother, not made by his brothers, not made by his cousins, 2 of whom are disciples themselves, but this request made by the rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. Folks, when Joseph goes in to see Governor Pontius Pilate that day, his life changes forever. He goes public with his faith. He comes down hard on one side for good. He's not a secret disciple any longer. Now, Mark tells us that Joseph buys a linen cloth and wraps the body of Jesus in it. But he's got some help in doing that. Who helps him? Another secret disciple, a man named Nicodemus. Well, what do I mean, calling Nicodemus a secret disciple? Remember, Nicodemus is also a prominent man in Israel. If he comes in the daytime, he might be recognized. What are people going to think of him? So he comes at night. Yes, Nicodemus can fairly be called a secret disciple too, at least in the beginning. So Joseph takes the body, and the Gospel of John tells us that Nicodemus, who first came to see Jesus by night, helps him. And Nicodemus brings with him the burial spices that are required by the custom of that day. But where are they going to bury the body? Well, in the area where Jesus is crucified, which would typically be outside the city limits, there's a garden not far away. And in that garden, there's a freshly made tomb carved out of the rock, and it's owned by Joseph of Arimathea, the rich man. By now, it's the late afternoon of Friday, but it is still Friday, day 1. Sunset has not arrived yet. And they get the body in the tomb of that rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, before sunset. Day 1. Folks, this is of God. Bible prophecies do not fail. God provides a rich man with an unused tomb near Golgotha, and the body of Jesus is buried before sundown on Friday. Probably Joseph and Nicodemus would both say they believe in the resurrection, but they don't seem to be thinking about a Sunday morning resurrection on the 3rd day, do they? After all, they wrap up the body with all the ointments and spices and wrappings as if they were going to preserve it until the judgment day. In fact, they want to use even more ointments and spices, but it seems they run out of time. It's getting darker. They've got to leave enough time so that they themselves can go home before the Sabbath starts at sunset. So eventually they get to a point where they dare wait no longer. They roll a stone against the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea with the body of Jesus inside, and they go home before the start of the Sabbath. Their plan is to come back Sunday morning, the first morning after the Sabbath, with additional spices so that they can complete the job properly. So they go home. They observe the Sabbath, a day of rest, according to the commandment of Moses. This is important. These average, everyday, common believers honestly, sincerely try to obey the law of Moses, to observe the Sabbath as a day of rest. Even though their leader, the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, has just been executed and buried, they nonetheless follow the commandment of Moses to observe a day of rest on the Sabbath. But what do their leaders do, their religious leaders? On the Sabbath, look at verse 62. On the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate. Now these are leaders. They should know better than to travel. They should know better than to go out and conduct a business transaction or a political transaction or any kind of business on the Sabbath. but they do it. They observe the law when they want to observe the law, and they ignore it when it's to their convenience to do so. And when they see Pilate, the governor, what do they tell him? Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I am to rise again. Now notice, now that they're talking to Pilate, they're not pretending anymore that when Jesus said that, he was talking about the physical temple building at Jerusalem. That was their claim earlier, but now it's revealed that that was only a pretense. They knew all along what he meant. They knew it all along, and now they've dropped the pretense entirely. And they ask Pilate to put a guard on the tomb until the 3rd day. Pilate tells them, sure, go ahead, make it as secure as you know how. So they do. And they go home that day probably feeling as if, well, we've taken care of all the angles now. We've got all our bases covered. That's the Sabbath. That's day 2. Sunday is coming. That will be day 3. But for right now, let's focus a bit longer on Joseph of Arimathea. He's been a secret disciple, but today, Good Friday, he goes public. Folks, look into your own heart. Are you a secret disciple? Joseph and Nicodemus went public with their faith out of commitment, out of loyalty to a person they probably thought was dead for good. That's real commitment. That's genuine loyalty. Yet you and I today have the benefit of history, the benefit of hindsight. We know Jesus rose again the 3rd day. Our commitment and loyalty should be even greater. We have no excuse whatsoever for not going public. If you're a secret disciple, it's time to let the world know whose side you're on. It's time to stop playing it safe. It's time to go public. It's time to let people know that you are committed to following Jesus Christ.